Welcome again to the Rosslyn Packer Theatre. This is about my fourth visit over the course of the past week. Some of you may have seen the odd show.
So if George falls asleep, we'll just keep going, okay?
Yeah, I may have mistaken this for the hotel room and then just doze off at some point. As we have at all our events, the Writers' Festival goes live and local. We've got sites across the country that are tuning in, getting a live stream, both audio and video. And I just want to welcome people in Albury, Bathurst, Broken Hill, Adelaide, Darwin, Frankston, Port Macquarie, Taree, Toowoomba and Townsville. Later on in our session, we'll get some questions that'll come up on the monitor, and I might we might do a couple of questions off the monitor, and then, even though I know on a couple of sessions I haven't taken questions from the audience, I promise for this one we will take questions from the audience, because I think Sarah and I might anticipate the odd contemporary political question, even
Perhaps.
though the subject of this particular discussion is The Killing Season, which is a most magnificent documentary for those of you who have seen it, a Logie Award winner. And if it wasn't for Waleed winning the gold, this would have been the news of the night, that The Killing Season won the Logie. In fact, absent of Waleed, you might have won the whole thing. Anyway, Sarah, welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome all. I hope your phones are on silent and you're tweeting like maniacs. Very first question, and I do have some background knowledge on the difficulty this show had the first time around. Explain to the audience how it is that you came to be doing this show, because it didn't start with you.
No, it didn't. And I'm sure many of you are aware that the ABC had made political series about Hawke and Keating and also about John Howard. But the great difference between those series, Labour in Power and the Howard Years, and this one was that in the case of Hawke and Keating, they were enthusiastic about the project, particularly Hawke, who actually gave letters out to people encouraging them to take part. Keating took a little bit of persuading, but not that much, and he was a great fan of the person who was making the series. In the case of John Howard, he was an enthusiastic supporter of the Howard Years, trusted the ABC, that may never come again, and he asked for nothing in return. He just wanted the transcripts to help him write his own memoir. By contrast, The Killing Season, which wasn't called The Killing Season then, it was just called Labour Doco, had no friends, no supporters, nobody wanted it, nobody in the Labour Party wanted it, and there were moments where even the ABC, I think, was getting fed up with it because it stalled, because Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard were particularly unwilling, and the Labour Party itself, when it was started like Labour in Power in 2013, before Tony Abbott came to power, I think the Labour Party was in shock at what had happened to the promise of its win in 2007, was drawn into itself. And then, of course, in 2014, they continued to try and make the series. But then, surprisingly, the Abbott government faltered early. And suddenly the Labour Party is left thinking, maybe we won't be in opposition for 1,000 years after all. Maybe we've got a shot of one day getting back into government. So the idea of a series revisiting that bloody past was even less attractive than it had been the year before. So nobody wanted it and nobody loved us.
And let's talk about the dance with both Kevin and Julia to get them to agree to be interviewed, because I'll ask you a couple of questions after that. But let's talk about how you got to first base with the two of them.
It was a dance. A dance is a very good description of it. And it was a very difficult dance because I had to be absolutely equal with both my dance partners. I couldn't show a preference or more of an ankle to one than the other at any point in the process. And while that's the normal posture of a journalist, in this particular case, because it went over a long period of time and both of them, I think, wanted us to show a bit more leg to one side than the other, it was very difficult to maintain that path because they're both persuasive people. Gillard was a little bit more willing. She had said that she didn't like the idea, and I think at one point she actually called the head of the ABC, Mark Scott, and asked him to take it off, that she didn't want it to happen, but she was at least open to the idea, but she wanted a veto on who was going to do the interviews, because she shared with Kevin Rudd, for very different reasons, very strong views about the press gallery. So there was an advantage in that myself and the series producer, Deb Masters, hadn't worked in the press gallery. Both Gillard and Rudd had formed very strong views about the way the press gallery had behaved, not actually including George Megalogenis, who was, Gillard described you, I think, as her white knight at one point. One of the few
She will be hearing from my lawyer, sooner or later. Actually, Many
So
of them.
it wasn't the whole press gallery, and that doesn't include George, but they were right in the sense that the press gallery, particularly in 2012, 2013, something did take place. There was a kind of pathology that grew up where the members of the press gallery had become partisan. She would say, particularly in Rudd's return, but I think it cut both ways at different times. So getting to first base, at least we had that. At least I was able to say, there is no reporting that I have done that you can judge me for. My one promise was that we would be fair, and that they wouldn't probably get the chance to have a team come at this extraordinarily, this material that is so divisive, where people's views on it are divided and very fixed, that they wouldn't get the chance to have a team come at it with an open mind, and that was the beginning of our foot in the door.
Yeah, now let's just unpack firstly we won't go into recriminations with the press gallery, but just unpack this idea that both of them were so worn out by the personal conflict that there was nobody in the building who covered the story, who were eyewitnesses to be able to report it. They thought reported fairly. From your vantage point in 2012, 2013, here in Sydney, were you aware of any of that? How much did you learn from the two of them about that other side to the story? Because both of them, and I've heard chapter and verse from them off the record about this person and that person, and that leak should never have been reported. Somebody should have. Was it something you could feel from here?
I think you got a sense of it towards the very end, when it really was going completely bonkers. But I think the biggest thing for us, both as a reader and as a journalist myself, that I felt that we were being ill-served, that these relationships were becoming very tortured, and that we had no means of judging whether or not stories were legitimate or not, that we had no clues in that material to be able to judge whether or not we were getting a straight leak from one side or the other. And I was very pleased in the series, as far as we could get, that at least some of the participants, a little bit from Kevin, a little bit from Julia, a lot from Alan Griffin, they were able to be frank about the way they briefed the media. I think that's okay, and I'm very glad that they were prepared to be a bit candid about it, but where does that leave us? That you had this relationship between Rudd and Gillard on different sides, and their supporters and their followers, and then you have the journalists in the press gallery, and we're excluded from that, and I think that's where it really went wrong, that we don't have the material, the knowledge to be able to tell whether what we're getting is a genuine story that's been properly gathered.
In defence of a lot of pretty much all my colleagues in the gallery, this was quite an unusual psychodrama. And sooner or later people get dragged in. And I think there were occasions where the Rudd or the Gillard camp sort of overanalyzed the motivation of the individual journalist. But it is the case, and this is a conversation that we have quietly amongst the more senior people. I'm not counting myself as a senior person. That one of the most difficult things that's happened to political journalism in the last 10 to 15 years is the way politics has been conducted is forcing journalists to choose. Most of them try to avoid making that choice, but still there are projections from one side onto one particular kind of journalist's work, and there are projections from another side and on another. And we do know, especially as the news cycle has sped up, a lot of people do much more commentary, which is much more emotive, which relies on easy access to somebody who is always going to look after them. So by way of observation, and maybe give me your feedback on that.
Look, one of the things that I remember most about Gillard and Rudd, and this goes partly to your question, I think the commentary thing is a huge problem. Actually, when I started writing this book, somebody asked me whether I wanted to become a commentator, and I said, as a working journalist, it's the one thing I could never do. I could do any job before I became a commentator. I can't be a commentator. I only have my neutrality. Without it, I am nothing, and I could never make... Let's just imagine there could be another series about politics, about two divided people taking each other's jobs. Crazy idea, but if it ever came again...
You wouldn't be able to point a camera at it.
If I had turned myself into a commentator, I think I should be completely out of the running. But I think it's interesting that both, as I say, Rudd and Gillard were so angry about that fact that people had signed up, that there was too much commentary, that journalists were turning into commentators. But as I said, at the same time, it may have been inadvertent, but I felt at the same time they wanted to see signs from us that we had done just that in the making of the series.
Exactly.
In particular, the first time that we met Julia Gillard, I had heard, of course, read a great deal about her and knew about the great personal warmth that she has. All her colleagues and friends attest to this, and that's what I was expecting to see. We arrived at the Hilton Hotel in Sydney for our very first meeting, and she walked into the room where we were waiting for her, hostile, very hostile. Bristling was the word that my colleague Deb Masters used at the time. And she sat down and told us that we couldn't make this series without the analysis of the media that you're talking about.
Yes.
It was in the forefront of her mind, and in fact it was also the very last thing she said when we had our final discussion in the back parking lot of the ABC as she left. And she asked me again, are you going to make this series about the media? So in both of their minds, that's what this period was about, but actually I don't agree. I think it's a very interesting phenomenon, and you're right, because it's a psychodrama, humans get sucked in, but it's their story first.
Okay, confession time. When I interviewed Kevin Rudd for the Making Australia Great television series, we had a breakfast which went for about an hour and a half, almost as long as the interview itself, because we didn't have that much time in Boston. And what do you think he wanted me to do with the television show?
Well, I think he would most certainly want you to make his role in handling the GFC salient.
No, but he did make exactly the point Julia made to you, which is at some point you need to do something about the role of the media.
Yeah, there we go, the perfect companion piece.
And in fact, it's quite unusual that the two of them would say exactly the same thing, but in a completely different setting. Every now and then you do get this thing between rivals who, and if you rerubbed out the name on top of the transcript, you wouldn't be able to pick out which one was winching.
Except that I can always pick Kevin Rudd because he uses more clauses than anybody else on earth. And I say that with respect, but you always know when you're getting into trouble with Kevin Rudd because those clauses, the subordinate clauses, just pile on top of each other like a great big Jenga, and then you have to pull out the bottom one to make it fall down. He does have the advantage of,
he's such a plain speaker, but this is one of the first things that happens when you point a camera. And my background is obviously print, and your cycle is from doco to book. My cycles have now been from books to a doco, to TV. When you pop a camera on someone who is, a practiced phrase maker, almost a political poet, and every now and then you pop the question to them and the camera's rolling, and suddenly the words start to go out here and here and here and here and here and here and here, and you think, at some point they must know that you can't use the grab, right?
Yes. Yes.
That's one of the reasons. I never knew that, because in print you never had to worry about it, because if you've got a nonsense answer, you've got a nonsense answer, you just moved on to the next question. But with the camera rolling, it does become a deliberate defence mechanism, doesn't it?
This is Kevin Rudd's great skill, and in fact my colleague who worked on this book with me, Trish Drum, I'm very happy to say is in the audience. There was a moment when we were interviewing Kevin Rudd, and I always like to say this because I think that I should be getting a medal for it. I interviewed Kevin Rudd for 18 hours.
18?
18. Yes,
Do you know what?
See?
I don't think Kerry even had 18 hours with Keating.
No.
18
hours all up. I think that Trish will tell me afterwards if I've added a couple of hours. It felt like 100 years, but it was fascinating from start to finish. But there is something that you notice with Kevin Rudd, and at one point we stopped to change the cards in the camera, and Trish came up to me and said, sotto voce, "I can't stand it anymore. He's not telling you anything. He's using the same grab over and over and over again." Yeah. And I said, yes, that is precisely Kevin Rudd's skill. He is not going to give me a single stray phrase that I can use to build the argument that I want to build, that I know lies underneath the narrative that he is telling, that he is so disciplined and understands in a preternatural way the way the media functions, that he knows how to control his answers. So in the end, even though Julia Gillard appeared to be much more guarded, his skill in shutting down his narrative meant that I had to get the subtleties from others, whereas in the end, with Julia Gillard, you can find the gaps.
And that's a difficult thing when, really, this story is about two people.
Yes.
It's about a co-prime ministership in the first term, which broke down at the end of the first term, and then a sort of hostage situation for the next 3 years. And if you've got one guy still playing that legacy game, and the other one who's half engaging, and then another half, the back does go up, because she's got this other facility, again, a plain speaker who suddenly freezes.
Yes.
But it's a different situation with Gillard, because she very quickly loses her warmth as a human being when her back gets up.
Yes.
And I wonder whether that's a difference in experience, or is it something to do with a sort of deeper reticence as the first female Prime Minister?
Well, I don't think it's a reticence associated with being the first female Prime Minister. I think it's her reticence. She talks about it in her book, that she has this natural reserve, and she compares herself to Barack Obama in that way. She says she always had reticence before going out and doing media. And again, this is the great pleasure of writing a book like this, to go back and look at the material that was not in the series. And some of the best material came from the speechwriters and the more junior staffers who didn't so all their material doesn't get into the series because you want to use the bigger players. But one of her speechwriters talked about this problem that they saw very early on. Do you remember the Queensland floods? She was compared unfavorably with Anna Bligh, who was so natural and warm out talking to people during the floods, and Julia was more stiff. And she said at the time she knew this was happening. She was conscious of it, but she didn't know how to stop it, and she had started second-guessing herself so much that the natural reserve was made greater by her awareness of it. And same thing, that there's a lovely photo of Julia Gillard on one of the books about, I think, gravity that Mary Delahunty wrote. And it's the photo taken by Sophie Dean, who was a young girl with Down syndrome whom Gillard met campaigning for the NDIS. And it shows that the warm, open Julia Gillard. And I asked many of her colleagues why we couldn't see that when she was Prime Minister. And again, it's that reticence, but also not being the first female Prime Minister, but Wayne Swan would say the sheer amount of abuse that she was on the receiving end of made it harder for her to overcome a natural reserve.
And when you're interviewing essentially both with Rudd and Gillard, it is very soon after the event that there's still some stuff to process between the two of them, well, personally, individually, and then between the two of them. Do you think that helped her in the way, do you think that the reticence also hindered her performance, if I can use the phrase performance? Is that a fair phrase?
No question. I think that something I observed about both of them quite early on, I thought their engagement with the series quite neatly mirrored their engagement in politics. So Gillard's, I think her attitude to the series and being in it once she'd agreed was that she would get through it, she would endure it. Whereas Rudd's was to conquer it. He wanted to conquer me, and he wanted to conquer the narrative, and he wanted to win it. Gillard just wanted to do her best, because you could see that she was trying to give good answers, but she just needed to get through it, and she made a decision early on to remain at arm's length, whereas Rudd is all about engagement. He wants to draw you into his world, and he's remarkably good at it. Again, Wayne Swan describes it as in a critical way, because he's come to dislike Kevin Rudd so intensely. He said what Kevin Rudd does is to build up banks of support in the media that he can use later on. So he'll give bits of information in order to get something back from the media later. Now, as long as you know that as an interviewer, when you're getting to know him, you can be careful, you can watch for the signs. But his is a very warm, natural engagement, and just as a human being, that's enjoyable. It's a rich conversation, whereas Gillard decided to maintain distance. And I saw her one day when we were filming the series with a makeup artist in Adelaide in the green room. They were trying to work out which jacket she was going to wear, and they were laughing and giggling, and you could see that natural side to her. And I remember thinking at the time, don't worry, we'll get there. I'll get to that point of engagement with her. And
never happened.
It never happened. And I tried some quite buffoonish tricks. I tried my smart tricks, and they didn't work. They bounced off, and so I tried my buffoonish tricks, which included me talking about shoes with her, which is one of the most silliest things I've ever done. I came into the studio. I know. It's so embarrassing, but it's better that I tell people, because then it's gone from me. I said, look at these marvelous, the relationship is not happening, and I'm used to being able to build easy, quick rapport with people. It's not a cheap trick. It just means that you have to be able to get to a point of authentic, genuine exchange with people quite quickly. You don't have 5 years to become their friends or to get to know them. You've got to do it in a short space of time. But nothing was working. So I came into the studio and I said, look at these marvelous shoes of mine. They're so well made, I can run in them. And so I ran around the studio, which was bigger than this whole theatre.
Fantastic.
And it would be like running up the stairs now, running down here and running down here. We came back and she was looking at me as if I was a complete idiot. And in that instance, I was. It was so misplaced. And as we left the ABC after our final interview, I thought, this is, we're coming towards the end. I'm going to have one last try. I don't know why at that stage, because it was pretty much over. And going down in the lift, which is a big props elevator at the ABC, it's huge. I was traveling with Justin Stevens, the producer, and we're very quiet in the lift. And I turned to Julia and I said, you know what, Julia? Justin does the best impersonation of you. I thought that she would say, well, go on, Justin. And by this stage, Justin, who's 30 and very polite, went an incredible colour of red. And she didn't say, Justin, can you do it? She just said, uh-huh.
Oh.
And then we had to travel all the way down to the bottom of the ABC with me bitterly regretting my failed attempts.
And given what you were actually aiming for, you were aiming to show the viewer. You weren't just interrogating a drama. You also wanted to show the full suite of the personalities that you were interrogating. So, at some level, you were trying to think, because she was giving you these deadpan responses. You're trying to think good of her, which is not an expression of bias. It's just for the sake of the storytelling, you need to find a way to get to that other Julia.
That's right.
And you couldn't get it.
What you don't want is the political Julia or the political Kevin. You know you're going to have them, of course. There's no way they're coming without those characters. But just to be able to get behind them a little bit. In fact, on the second day of our interviews with Kevin Rudd, I think he must have listened to the interviews overnight because he was recording them on his phone. And he came back the next day and the performance was awful. He decided that he didn't sound sufficiently prime ministerial. Okay. And so he came back and went back into soundbite mode and was leaning forward and doing those gestures. And by the end of that day, I actually did a very unusual thing at the end of that day. I rang two people. I rang Alan Griffin, the Victorian MP, who was then doing a stint at the UN, and he told me that the only way to get through the interviews and to get Kevin to behave differently was for me to take non-prescription drugs, which absolutely does not fit into the ABC Charter. So I didn't do that. And then actually I rang my husband, who's also a journalist, and he said it was like a scene out of Frost Nixon. I don't know if you've seen that movie, but halfway through, Frost calls his producers because he's not getting anywhere with Nixon. And my husband's very good advice at that point was to stop walking on eggshells with Kevin Rudd. He's so emotional that you can get very easily drawn into his managing his moods, which is what happens to a lot of people with him. And we were so nervous that he was going to pull out because the journey for him saying yes, although he said yes, there were some very shaky moments on the way, and I think I was still treating him too gently. So the advice was very good. You don't need non-prescription drugs, you just need to go for it. And so we did, and from that point, we got a lot further, a lot quicker.
And, full credit to be able to get them both on screen, and so soon after the event. So you sort of mark that partly your professionalism, but the other thing is the advantage of being a clean skin, as we mentioned earlier. I just want to test the hypothesis that the disadvantage of being a clean skin is a lot of the things they talk about. You wouldn't have had the eyewitness press gallery inside the bubble knowledge. So when we're talking about what went down during the decision to defer and then ultimately to run away from climate change, you're hearing people's testimony 2 and 3 years after the fact.
Yes.
How do you weigh that up?
Very difficult. At the very least, never mind mendacity and what role it may play. There's the role of memory, the depredations of time on the memory, and as we all know, the more emotional event, the less effective the memory is. So even with the best will in the world, those stories had been shaped by their own retelling many, many times. So and we had a rule that we were having no third-party accounts. The only accounts that we would take were from those people in the room, which at least means that you've got some degree of accuracy. And we were also very strict about off-the-record material, that we weren't going to let people shape this narrative unless they were prepared to be in it, which puts the threshold of truthfulness just a little bit higher. Some people will still look down the barrel of the camera and lie, but it's harder for them to do it when their colleagues are watching. With those particular decisions, it was an extraordinary thing because, as Greg Combet said, this is perhaps the most important decision of the Rudd government, and such a disastrous one to delay the CPRS. And nobody could remember where the decision was actually taken. So we were lucky enough to find a magic piece of footage. We went through 1,500 hours of archive material in the making of this series, and we found in a box a scene with Kevin Rudd and Andrew Charlton sitting in the courtyard in Parliament House. Looked on the date of the box, realised it was the date that decision was made, asked Andrew Charlton to come back, who'd already done his interview, to talk about it. Outside, and this was why this was such a precious moment, he said they were going through the options. So this is the version that they were going to give to us. They were going to defer the CPRS, but here were the weighing up which of the versions they were going to use to explain it to the public. And in this lovely scene, you have members of the press gallery walking up to chat to them, having no idea of the enormous event that's taking place. And Andrew Charlton, as he described it, would turn over the piece of paper, chat to Andrew Probyn, chat to Malcolm Farr. They'd walk away, turn the page open again. And then they went back inside, and the decision was taken to take the CPRS measures out of the budget. But whether or not the actual decision was taken at that moment, nobody remembers. Not Greg Combay, not Wayne Swan, not Julia, not Kevin. But the nice thing about that scene is, for me, out of the mouths of babes, children, and staffers, Kevin Rudd tried to argue that he was not ready to make that decision that day, that he hadn't reached a decision, that in the meeting, Gillard and Swan pushed him to make a decision, whereas in fact Andrew Charlton made it very clear that they had made a decision and they were considering how they were going to explain it. So I think in that case, we got to a truth. It's not the whole truth, it's not the entire picture, but it's a crucial slice of that terrible decision, which, as Lachlan Harris said, is the thing that the Labour Party in that period should most examine in terms of the over-reliance on polls. How can you rely on polls to make a decision as important as that? What a disaster. He blames everyone, he says, including himself, except Penny Wong, who was the one person saying...
And in fact, that is, notwithstanding the clean skin insider dichotomy, the fact is that you had a bit of insider footage meant that you could go back.
That's right, but a very rare thing. You imagine our joy finding it. The same Justin tore off his headphones and said, "Come and look at this, I think this is the CPRS day," because imagine telling a story about the CPRS, which is complicated, difficult to explain, and all of the meetings took place behind closed doors, so there won't be a skerrick of footage. All you've got are people's memories, and then by a stroke of luck, somebody had kept that one little piece of footage.
But on the day of that the relationship broke down on the 23rd of June 2010, because there's only a couple of months after
later.
the CPRS was taken out of the budget, there's very little footage of that day.
So because of course the press were taken a little bit by surprise, by the time Julia Gillard went in to see Kevin Rudd for the fatal meeting, there is one tiny piece of footage. It is seconds long, and as these things go, there are two blokes walking in front of Julia Gillard. She's walking into Kevin Rudd's office, and there's these two chaps lumbering down the corridor, no idea that the world is just changing right behind them, getting in the way. It's like, move! So for the only time in the whole series, we slowed the vision down and put a little marker on Julia Gillard just to show that tiny thing. And so we had to tell the whole of that story with no images. There's no photos. There's no images from Kevin Rudd was at a drinks at 6 p.m. when the story, just before 7 p.m. when the story broke. There is nothing. There's no photographs from inside. Luckily, Tony Abbott let us film inside the Prime Minister's courtyard, and I think we used every single frame and mixed it in with the other images that we had. And we used a morning tea to be the drinks, and we changed the colour of the sky. We had people walking through Parliament House, again changing the colour of the sky to make it look like it was nighttime. It really was like a play school putting together of things from old bits of cardboard.
I'd imagine that would have been the easiest pitch in the entire history of the ABC to a Prime Minister's office. Can we have full insider access just to set some scenes up, because we're going to juxtapose them with Gillard?
Unsurprisingly, Tony Abbott said, "You want my office to
in
tell
fact,
that
we'll clear
story?
the government out for the day. You can have it all."
Can you come? I should say Kevin Rudd was very generous when the ABC wanted to film in the same office for the Howard years, so there was a precedent. There
was a precedent. Now, that's this one of the ones I actually wanted to drill down to. There were only 3 people in the room that day.
Yes.
And of course, you didn't have John Faulkner. Did you think either Kevin Rudd or Julia Gillard can even get close to the truth of what happened that day in their own heads? Because they would have been very difficult to interview. I'll give you a theory in a sec about what I think happened that day, because I think we all have theories. But I just wanted to see in terms of when you were interrogating the two of them, and you would have had to spend a lot of time on this particular moment.
Yes.
Do you think either of them actually have got their heads around what happened?
I think that Kevin Rudd has a clearer picture of what happened. I think when he says that Julia Gillard had agreed to give him more time, that they had reached that point in the conversation, that she was at the very least, but was interrogating the idea that is something that could work. The only point that I think he's wrong on in that scene is that he says they shook hands. I'm not sure that happened, but his version, which is that she was about to give him, she had reached the point where she was going to give him 6 months to turn things around, is where she had got to. And the reason I'm confident about that is that, first of all, his telling of the story, instinctively for me, it has verisimilitude in it. I'm inclined to believe it, judging by the way he tells it. And something very interesting happens to Julia Gillard's language when she tells that story. And this is something that you notice with Julia Gillard throughout her all longer interviews she ever does, which is Julia Gillard can be amazingly precise. She's efficient and precise in the way in which she deals with information and has conversations and gets through material. It's her great strength. When she wants to obfuscate, her language changes and she removes all of that precision and she starts talking in quite strange metaphors that you wouldn't actually use if you were trying to be efficient. So she describes the idea that she was going to give Kevin Rudd more time as maybe that wedge of hope, that wedge of sun.
Makes no sense, yeah.
Is something that he took from it. And I interrogated her over and over about her language, why she was using these very vague terms, because she reaches the point where she concedes it, and then in the next answer she pulls it back. And she does this a couple of times in relation to the leadership change, that she gets all the way there, realizes that she's gone a bit too far, and pulls it back. But the way she obscures that series of events is by using obscure language, and I sensed it actually before I became aware of it. You feel that she's using language, and the sense of what she's saying is receding, and you have to pull her back to being the other, more precise Julia Gillard, because she'll try and put up a curtain of mist in front of.
And how much did you pick up in the edit
truth.
suite? So I know it's very difficult when you have to go through your questions, and you have, a battery may go, you may need to change a light.
Yeah.
In the edit suite, do you pick up things that you missed in the room?
Well,
or are you looking for different things?
One of the things I missed actually in the room when we were interviewing her is that we were doing actually a lighting change, and we were talking about the CPRS decision. So the camera's still rolling, but we're not in the interview at that moment. And she talks about, I make reference to Kevin Rudd's use of the phrase "great moral challenge," and Julia Gillard rolled her eyes. She went, "Oh." And you very, very rarely see that side of her because she's so disciplined. And Kevin Rudd had referred to the fact
tells you everything,
that
actually.
in Cabinet she had started doing that, and then she did it, but we didn't see it until we were sitting in the edit suite and we caught it. Now, we didn't use it because it wasn't...
It's not on the record.
It wasn't on the record, but there it was.
Yes.
Yes, there are a lot of tells with both of them. I could play poker, I could clean up with a pair of them because I know their tells. So if they ever do get rid of the ABC, I'm going on the poker tour with Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd.
Now, I want to talk about some of the other people. First, I'll talk about the people that you wouldn't film. So we mentioned John Faulkner, but John Faulkner is John Faulkner. He's never going to tell any story.
Well, I think I like to give John Faulkner a hard time about this. I think he makes a fetish out of his discretion. Discretion, of course, how could you argue with discretion not being a good thing in politics? But I think in that case, in the case of that event in the room, I've said this to him and he's disagreed with me vehemently, I think that event belongs to history. And Gillard and Rudd have come, Rudd certainly wants him to tell the story of what happened.
That's the other thing, he's been released.
He's been released from his deed, but it's a fetish and he won't.
I do remember the mood he was in on the night of the 2010 election when they'd lost they lost their majority and it looks like they were going to lose government. He kept walking around going, "I told you we were in trouble. I told you we were in trouble."
Yeah.
I think I'm allowed to say that. I don't think that's off the record. A couple of others and the important ones. Mark Abib, obviously. Bill Shorten.
Yes.
You can understand why Bill Shorten wouldn't be involved. Penny Wong.
Well, I don't think we should skip over Bill Shorten. Let's stay with Bill Shorten, eh?
Yeah.
I mean,
No. Yeah. But in terms of the Gang of Four...
Yes.
Not the Gang of Four, sorry, in terms of the people in the room for the CPRS.
Yes.
And Penny Wong and Lindsay Tanner were the two who still
So
wanted
Lindsay
to stick
Tanner,
with.
this is just a mistake I made. We interviewed Lindsay Tanner. He didn't want to take place at first, but then we interviewed him. But, remember, he's the guy that wrote a book about the dumbing down of politics, the dumbing down of democracy by the media. So he wasn't someone who was inclined to give sexy grabs for us. And I didn't use him, and it was a mistake. I could have found a place for him. It's just that this is one of the things about television compared to a book, and why the book is such a treat for me, is because television, of course, you have all of the demands of dramatic storytelling that you don't have in a book, and so you need people to tell things with clarity and with drama. But people thought that Tanner had said no because we didn't use him. And Penny Wong, I tried everything. I texted her, I rang her, I wrote to her, I went to Parliament House, I stood like an idiot outside her room. She could see me outside, she wouldn't come out, she just didn't want to take part. And I think part of that was to do with the difficulty of the decision she made to go back to Kevin Rudd in 2013. Exactly. So she didn't want to.
And there's one other, we'll talk about Bill Shorten in a second. Tim Gartrell, you didn't get him either.
No, I think Tim Gartrell, as you may know, is now working for Recognise, and I think the idea of re-examining his partisan life was not something he wanted to be associated with.
I
That's
pitched
just me guessing, but
Yeah,
you know.
no, I pitched. Tim Guttrell was the National Secretary of the
Yes.
Labor Party, lost one election with Mark Latham and then won one with Kevin Rudd in 2007. And because he's working at Recognise, I asked him and Mark Textor if
Yes.
they would be filmed together for my show. And Mark says, great. Rang Tim. Tim said, I'm out of it. I do not want to get back in. So I'm not surprised that he didn't.
Mark Arbib was a much, talk about dances, I had the longest dance with Mark Arbib. We got very close because he was, of course, one of the key figures in rolling Kevin Rudd in 2010. And at one point he was gone off to work for Crown Casino, which was produced one of Kevin Rudd's loveliest lines, there goes the heart and soul of the New South Wales Labor Party, off to Casino Land, and then he does a great big Kevin Rudd pause. Was that too harsh?
That was.
He can, when he's good, he's very, very good. I got close with Mark Arbib and he started asking, well, if we did it, how would it go? And I was feeling very pleased that we'd got it. And then he got on a plane to go to the US, and I've always felt that he succumbed to that being up in the air and thinking, looking back on Australia and thinking, do I really need to go back? I don't. And he came back and said, I'm not doing it. Oh.
And did he make an effort on background to influence the story that was being told about him? Because he's there. You've got him in. You couldn't avoid putting him in the show.
He was in the show, but my view and very strict rule from the beginning, from the moment I arrived, was that no one was able to shape that narrative if they weren't in it. So he had an argument, like Carl Batar, that they wanted to make about their election prospects in 2010, and we were not going to include any of that material. Be in it, turn up, let people judge you, judge your face, judge your telling. You don't get to give it to us underneath the door of the office.
And Bill Shorten, should he? I mean, I know we would love to have him involved, but should he have been involved?
Well, people say, oh, it's obvious that he shouldn't. You know, if you were working for him, you know, you would advise him not to do it. Why would he? But I think it's more complicated than that. I think for Bill Shorten now, he wants to be our Prime Minister. I think we get to know what motivates him. I think we get to know whether or not he's trustworthy. And he says that a number of times he said that he explained why he voted for Kevin Rudd in 2013 because he'd been criticised for not doing so in 2010. But that's where his sentence stops. He doesn't then go on to say, and let me explain who was the Bill Shorten of 2010 who played a crucial role in removing a first-term Prime Minister. And remember this extraordinary fact about that group of men, because it was all men, factional men in the Labour Party. Not one of them had been in Parliament for more than 3 years. Apart from Tony Burke, who played a role on the day and was involved in conversations with Mark Arbib, all of the key movers on the day were all new to federal politics. The people who had driven it to that point, Kim Carr got involved very late, but all of the others were all new to federal politics. Arbib, Shorten, Don Farrell. None of them had been through the hard slog of opposition. It's it's a significant point. Yeah. Bill Shorten, we went to meet him. I had dinner with him in a restaurant in Canberra. There was a screen that hid us from the curious public, and I thought that's the perfect metaphor for Bill Shorten's attitude, not just to the series, but really to all of these events, that he doesn't want to be grilled on them. And he's done a very clever thing, which is that if you look at the archive, if you go and try to find pictures of Bill Shorten in relation to those events, despite his central role, apart from those shots of him on the night in the Vietnamese restaurant that he's tried to turn into, he was on the phone to his child's teacher, which I'm sure he was, but he was also on the phone to Gillard's staffers, that the archive is clean, and I think that's the way that Bill Shorten wanted it. He wanted to have no trace, no material made available to the Liberals now. And I understand that that's a strategy, but I think for someone who wants to be Prime Minister, that you have to take us through those events. That's my view.
And if there is a couple of Prime Ministerial debates, you want to see that question asked.
You would want to see that question asked.
Now, there are a number of other characters.
It doesn't have to be dwelt on. He's entitled to say, I want to move on to the battles of the future, and I think that's right. But I think we just need to know what's happened to that Bill Shorten.
Now, there are a couple of other, in fact, there are more than a couple of others. There are a number of second stringers, but who are involved, who made career-defining choices to cooperate. So I'm thinking of Sam Dastiari with the mobile phone. I'm thinking about Mark Bishop, you know, almost calmly, even callously saying, yeah, I rolled him and then I rolled her.
Yes.
I rolled that little ball down, you know.
Yeah.
Who are these people? And what did you think as you were getting the testimony from some of the ones who wanted to be involved in what was clearly a train wreck of a government?
Well, with all of them, and Tony Burke was another who we set up for an interview with him in a bar in the Hilton downstairs in the Marble Bar, And there was something about, I've always thought there was something about the quiet intimacy of that setting that maybe drew him out more than he intended. And at the time, it was also, none of this was easy because at this stage I still wanted Mark Arbib to take part, and Mark Arbib is a very close ally and friend of Tony Burke, so whatever I said to Tony Burke was going to be repeated to Mark Arbib. So you need to do a tough, clear interview, but not in a way that's going to damage your chances of getting Mark Arbib. So that's quite a complicated thing. But there in the dark in the Hilton Hotel bar, somewhere where Tony Burke used to go as a young man, I think we arrived at a confessional atmosphere, and he told us in great detail how he had made the decision, got involved, all of the things that he had done. And to be honest, to this day, I still don't quite understand why he wanted to place himself, someone with a big future ahead of him, he would consider in the Labour Party and in government, why he would want to put himself right in the heart of such a really a rotten series of events. It puzzled me. Sam Dastyari, I think Sam Dastyari just likes being out there being Sam Dastyari.
Yeah, and in fact,
and he does it so well.
Having done it, and then social media lit up as soon as that image went on of him on the dasher, on the phone. He very quickly tweeted that he regretted it or made some other joke at his own expense. So he probably does enjoy the attention. Now, I'll ask you a couple of specific questions. If you were any of them, would you have cooperated with your TV show?
That's such an unfair question, isn't it? What's the honest answer to that? Look, the thing is, you can always not take part. You can always take what I think is the coward's way out. But this story, and I felt this very, very strongly, this story belonged to us. This wasn't their story. All of the pollsters will tell you, whether you were a Labour supporter in 2007 or not, there was a huge reignition, if you like, of interest and enthusiasm in politics in 2007. Something had ended. It was the end of John Howard's era. That era of politics was over. A huge number of people came with great enthusiasm to politics in that time, and that, as Alan Milburn put it so beautifully that we used at the end of the series, that great promise was trashed, and he said he'd never seen so much promise so comprehensively trashed in any political system, in any series of political events, in anywhere in the world, he said. So I felt that we had not had that sufficiently explained, that this was our story, they were voted for, the government went wrong, it turned very, very messy towards the end, and we hadn't had an adequate explanation. So it was my view, this wasn't me trying to snakily persuade people to do things. I really felt like they had an obligation to tell us what had happened. And then at the same time, both sides, and this is the other thing that's going on in their motivation, both sides wanted their narrative to be dominant. And I'm not just talking about Rudd and Gillard, I'm talking about their supporters all the way down to the most junior staffers. There were very few people who sat in the middle, really only 2 or 3 people who crossed over by that stage, and they wanted the Rudd narrative or the Gillard narrative to be the dominant one, the one that history takes away, justified or not the 2010 challenge, that's the fulcrum of it. So that's the other reason, and that's a very good reason. So you think, well, if they promise me an open mind, I've got a chance of having my narrative come out on top.
And do you think either camp are aware of what went wrong? Like what they were responsible for? Because it's easy to blame the other side for losing the plot, but...
Apart from the bland line that's repeated over and over about disunity being death, no, I don't think they do. I think that what's happened to Rudd and Gillard is that they have become even more fierce in their certainty that what went wrong was the other's fault. So Julia has a narrative that she constructs, and it is a constructed narrative, that leads to the challenge in 2010 being inevitable, inexorable, and in the national interest. So she wants to build a path that goes straight to those events with no, as she puts it, no alternate reality.
Do you believe that, by the way? Do you believe that?
No, I don't believe that.
Yeah.
I think there were alternate realities. There were other ways of handling it. I don't think it was. It wasn't inevitable. Kevin Rudd has an equally constructed narrative on his side. And what he does is he puts Julia Gillard's decision to challenge him on a moral plane. So it's not a political decision. He takes it out of the political sphere, and he builds this sense of Julia Gillard being a good person. He keeps saying, I thought Julia was a good person. Julia was a good person. Therefore, her decision to challenge me is the result of being a bad person. So all of the others made a bad political decision. Julia's was a moral decision. So the two of them have got these, both of them, constructed narratives, not entirely truthful, not truthful. When I say that, I mean not truthful to the events, trying trying to competing with each other and competing with me as well in the middle, trying to get one of those narratives to be dominant. And blame each other is the answer to your question.
Yeah, and but
their fault.
But both constructs are eminently quotable and usable in a TV show, but it doesn't actually get you to the finish line, does it?
No.
Which is why that Alan Milburn quote was brilliant at the
Yes.
end. And it wasn't just in enthusiasm for politics. The permission that government was given to do things for the Australian people.
Yes, you remembered the right word, the permission that was granted them.
They were granted permission. And at some point they started arguing amongst themselves. I'll just give you a very quick take of what I think the thing that neither of them can admit to themselves about on the events of the 23rd of June. Their relationship had been pretty good. It clearly had become a bit fractured. I think, and this is one of the reasons why I think neither of them will ever get their head around it, they both lost their cool that day.
Yes.
Right? And their relationship up to that point had been symbiotic. And Gillard put a great store on never losing her cool. And clearly she lost control of that day.
Yes.
Up until the fine-grained detail, which you did get in the show, the staffers were saying, you're staying in the room too long, he's persuading her out of the challenge.
Yes.
This is one of the reasons why you would think that the Rudd version of events is closer to the truth.
Yep.
But the other thing is, I think he put great store in his relationship with her. I think basically she was the only person in the government that he got on with.
Yep. That's right.
I think, and at some visceral level, he probably never admitted to himself that's the one relationship he should have taken more care of. He didn't care if David Feeney came in and asked for, a rethink on the entitlements. He just told him to PO. He said he was a bit stronger than that, and he was quite happy to tell journos he told him that. But that particular relationship, I think a lot of people think he's an unusual character. Yes, but he's quite functional at that at that level. So he understood that the government was a co-government. What do you think about that as the particular?
I like that theory of them losing their cool that day, because if you examine what he did that day, none of it makes sense. So an article appears in the paper in the morning, which it's very interesting because this is supposedly the trigger for the day. It's a piece in the Sydney Morning Herald, and on close examination it looks like it doesn't stand up. And this was a story suggesting that Kevin Rudd's Chief of Staff, Alistair Jordan, was ringing around gauging support for him. And she read the article, burst into tears, called for John Faulkner, says that at that moment all her doubts about Kevin Rudd crystallised. The problem is that the article probably was not founded in truth. We went back and re-examined all of as many members of caucus and cabinet as we could, and couldn't find that story was true. So it looks like the story was possibly planted in some way, or the information was not correct. But at that moment, Kevin Rudd hears that Julia Gillard's upset about the article. He goes around to see her. They have a conversation. It isn't resolved. And then throughout the day, even when members of his staff start picking up the fact that something is going on, as it was after question time, Shorten and Arbib and Farrell and Feeney and Kim Carr go to a meeting, and they're planning what they're going to do and encouraging her to challenge, and they start to hear that numbers are being counted. Rudd's office didn't do anything. They took no action. Lachlan Harris sent Sean Kelly up to the press gallery to see what was happening. Nothing was happening. But they weirdly just sat in their office, and they say that they could no longer communicate with Wayne Swan and Julia Gillard. But if you know the geography of Parliament House, it's just there and there. But nobody spoke to each other. No one rang each other. Gillard didn't ring Rudd. Rudd didn't ring her. They didn't ring Wayne Swan. He just sat in his office. So throughout that day, his behaviour was very strange. It was as if nothing was happening when, in fact, his government was in dire trouble. Neither he nor his office responded. Particularly, there was no sense of it being an emergency. And the same thing, she took a long time to get into that meeting. And then, of course, it went on for a very long time. So I think the idea of her losing her cool is very good. I think that she was filled with uncertainty in that moment. And that, for me, delivers us one of the least palatable ironies. And so it's why the idea of, when I set out to make the series, I thought I would be spending a long time thinking about Julia Gillard as the first female Prime Minister. But that great unpalatable irony almost knocks it out, because at that moment, it's the factional men of the Labour Party who put Julia Gillard in power. And that, for me, I think it makes that moment, what should be a moment of triumph, actually, it spoils that moment really dramatically.
And knowing what followed,
yes,
it made perfect sense that that government failed.
Yes.
And that her Prime Ministership, I think, to all intents and purposes...
as all her colleagues say, was damned from the first day.
Yes.
Her most fervent supporters Paul Howes, former head of the AW, you remember him, he cries through the interviews. He and Craig Emerson, same thing. Deeply devoted to Julia Gillard and deeply aware that their actions in removing Kevin Rudd destroyed her. And how clever was Anthony Albanese to pick it on the night, the only one?
He did pick it on the night. I'm going to ask you one last question, because I think we're going to give the audience a chance. So can people head towards the microphones? Somebody throw their hand up where the microphones are, and then I want to be able to see. They're just here, over the exit signs. So a couple of people on each side. And, sorry?
And up there.
Oh, we've got a couple up there as well. Okay, so we'll try and take 4. They got definitely no speeches. Now, imagine for a brief second, or imagine for 6 years, you're Tony Abbott.
He's quite the inquisitor, this guy, isn't he?
Am I?
How long do I have to get myself into that?
Okay, well, that's why I've paused for effect. I'm waiting for you to actually...
No, actually, I'm there.
Okay, so have you observed this most extraordinary thing? So you are an eyewitness to the destruction of a government. For really no policy reason, just the fact that the two principals didn't get along.
Yeah.
And you're going to become Prime Minister eventually because of this. Why didn't you learn a single thing? And will you, because now you're Tony Abbott, right, and I'm Sarah Ferguson, will you be in my TV show, and when are we doing the show for the Liberals in power?
Well, you know, I'm taking as a comment the fact that I didn't learn anything as Tony Abbott. I think I learned a lot.
Sorry, for a split second there I thought you were Tony Abbott. No, I didn't actually think you were Tony Abbott, but...
I learned a lot.
But what do you think? What do you think they missed? So it's not like history, that kind of political history stopped in 2013.
What is the one thing that I believe when Tony Abbott took over, when the Liberal Party said, we're going to be the grown-up government, I believed them.
I believe them too.
The last thing I thought was that we would see a repeat. And, you know, of course the dynamics are different, the polling dynamics are different, whatever polling is worth these days. Yes, they were significantly different, but still, in terms of disruption and upheaval, I think we're the losers until this idea that disruption is always available. We already have these very short terms in Australia compared to other countries. The idea that within a 3-year term you are always vulnerable to a set of bad polls, even if it's a very long set of bad polls, it has to hurt our polity, doesn't it?
It does, and that's absolutely why I stopped talking about opinion polls about 6 years ago.
Yes. Partly
because I think we all picked where it was going, and they all knew where it was going, but they couldn't help themselves.
Yes.
Do you think there'll be another show? And would you do it?
Me, Sarah, or me, Tony?
No, well, you're back.
Which
Let's go back to Sarah. You're relieved of
my role.
Your role as Tony Abbott.
Well, if
in this
I'm
interview.
Tony Abbott, I am definitely doing it, Sarah. I'm definitely going to do it.
And Sarah, do you want to do it?
What do you reckon?
Yeah, hands up for it.
Yes, please.
Already. Okay, we'll take the first question here. Ladies and gentlemen, and in our live site.
Oh, I'm going to get told
How
off again.
did this happen? Can you please identify yourself?
Yes, sir.
My name's John Faulkner.
Thank you, John.
And I was a witness to history. And it's about that I want to yet again address Sarah, who today has developed her thesis, I am now a fetishist. I am a fetishist apparently because I gave a commitment, I gave my word on the night of the Australia's Prime Minister changed, that I would not talk about the events in that. That was the basis on which I was there. And I know it doesn't suit journalists. And I know it would be helpful if I retailed those events, and not only that, a whole range of private conversations, but I gave my word I would not. I'm honouring my word, and I'm not a fetishist. Pity a few more people involved in Australian politics didn't honour their word. Now, can I just... My question is this. It relates to the events of that evening. would you, and I've asked you this publicly before, Sarah, but you knew I was in the audience that time.
I did say exactly the same thing.
Is it fair to say, in terms of the public accounts of the evening in the room, and given there are only 3 people there and one of them has said nothing, yours truly, the other 2, and fair enough, they didn't give their word like I did. I gave my word. They've given their accounts. But isn't it fair to say, really being frank about it, there is little difference in these accounts, bar the fact that Kevin has said that hands were shaken, and Julia has effectively said that she gave significant false hope to Kevin. I think that's a fair way of putting the differences in the accounts. Now, I know whether hands were shaken or not, and I'm not going to say. But I'm asking you, my question, the serious question is, it is fair to say, isn't it, that there's very little difference in terms of the public accounts from both the other 2 participants in the meeting?
That's absolutely right. It all comes down to the word effectively. And as a journalist, I want to arrive at that very rare thing in political reporting, which is a fact. They are like spectres that come, take shape, and then evaporate before you. There are very few certainties in political reporting. And because that scene in the room is so important in terms of this political period, I want to get to a sentence that doesn't include the word effectively. Because what Julia Gillard does, while she's exactly as John Faulkner says there, that she acknowledges that effectively, yes, she gave him hope, but then in the next answer, in the interview that we did with her, she pulls back from that. So although we have the first answer, and that yes, she's acknowledging that she may have given him false hope, it's Kevin Rudd's version that she did, not that she may have, that she actually did. And I want to get to the very end of that sentence. But as John said, it's only a small distance. I just always want to get to the end of the line, that's all.
Now, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to take one more question from... Now, you've got about... sorry about this, you've got about 30 seconds. And we're trying to keep... Sorry about this. We do have to turn the room over for the next event.
And seeing the relationship between journalists and the media and this constant turmoil over leadership, it seems like this is really all we've known. Do you think that sets quite a precedent for how politics and journalists are going to react and work together in the future?
Well, it's a very good question. Remember what Tony Abbott said when he was removed, that the media had carried the assassin's knives, that relationship, I don't think that we have sufficiently examined our role in these events. And in that sense, both Gillard and Rudd were right to say that is something that needs to be examined. I think the relationship is still problematic. I would say that's from outside the gallery. Yes. It's obviously the case that a great deal of very good work is done by the media, but that closeness, I think, remains a problem particularly for the public who can't tell whether they're getting stories that have been gathered properly as journalists or whether they're just being dumped.
There's a couple of things to remember. So I've got lived experience of the Hawke Keating challenge, and that was, and this is where I do the compare and contrast between Rudd and Gillard and Abbott and Turnbull. Hawke and Keating did have their supporters in the press gallery, but that was a different time. So still a policy, evidence-based focus. I mean, everybody still reported a lot of politics, and there was a leadership blue on. But I could probably count on 2 fingers the journos who took sides from the press gallery in those days. And I know when when Hawke won the first ballot, the Keating people had a bit of a party. All the journos came in, no one was kicked out, and a lot of the Hawke staffers came in for the farewell after he lost the first challenge. And then again, when the second ballot happened and Hawke lost his leadership, there was a bit of a free flow between both camps. So there was still a relationship in a sense that there was a government that would have to continue the work and was in trouble at the time. But that I don't know when we lost that, but that isn't there now, and it hasn't been there for a little while on both sides of politics. And I think the next generation of journos in the gallery, and you're right, I think they've only known this one world, they have been forced to choose. Most of them are resisting the temptation, but I think numerically you'd have to accept that more of them have sort of succumbed to the pressure to choose than did in the past. So that's probably the most sort of diplomatic way I can put it.
It's bleak though, isn't it? And I think that you should ask for more and better from us.
Yeah, absolutely.
All the time. And if you think that you're getting political reporting that isn't straight, you need to complain loudly and bitterly.
And we're... Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, George.
We're only a couple of minutes over time, and this is my 6th and final session at the Sydney Writers' Festival. For those who've seen just this one or a couple, thank you very much to everyone at the festival. It is a terrific event. Now, please give it up for Sarah Ferguson.
Thank you. Thanks, George. It was beautifully done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.